everyone, and welcome to the Chicago Justice Show. I'm your host, Tracy Siska, and I'm also the executive director of the Chicago Justice Project. You can find out more about our transparency accountability work, including all the litigation that's ongoing, at chicagojustice.org. Today we got a great show. It's packed. I'm going to give you a rundown real quick of what we're going to be talking about. First two segments are on two editorials from the Chicago Tribune. One about how our criminal justice leaders are failing us in Chicago. Editorial board, hint, look in the mirror for who is failing Chicago the most. Also, one on the tragedy involving everything around the shooting of Adam Toledo. They're not entirely wrong on that one, except it's not far enough, progressive enough thinking. It's still only looking at reforms within the criminal justice system, which is a problem. We have what I would consider a kind of weak story from Jamie Kelvin from the Invisible Institute. It ran in the Intercept. It has to do with ShotSpotter, that crappy technology. And we're going to talk about some numbers that they report from a forthcoming report this week from the MacArthur Justice Center at Northwestern Law. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about an op-ed from the State Registry and Journal written by two violence against women advocates in Chicago, and about basically just a warning to stop exploiting survivors, to shield yourselves from reform. It's a really fascinating piece. And then we're going to take a break. And then after the break, we have three segments dealing with national issues. One on a poll from Washington Post ABC about criminal justice thinking or criminal justice reform thinking around the country. We have a piece by Arnold Ventures, which used to be the Arnold Foundation, talking about justice data needs. They're not entirely wrong either, but also they're still thinking within a box that doesn't do communities as much good as it should. And we finished today on a New York Times story talking basically about trying to find ways to get rid of pretextual stops for stupid things that police use to pull cars over and go on fishing expeditions. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But first, as we always talk on Mondays, this is your chance to help us get involved in this show, become a sponsor. You can go to the link that hopefully is going to be appearing in the chat very shortly. You can sponsor this show. We stream 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 5:30 Central. Plus, we're getting back up, starting with our streams of police board meetings. We're going to stream police City Council and Cook County Board and Illinois General Assembly meetings related to criminal justice matters, but we need the resources to do it. This is your chance to help us out. Donate, and we can get and start streaming all of that for you. We'd really appreciate it. We do corporate sponsorship, so if your company wants to get involved, we can tailor a sponsorship plan to your needs. So our first segment today is an editorial from the Tribune, reading how Chicago's leaders are failing on the epidemic of violent crime. And they have a picture of Kim Foxx. So, God, this is so full of crapola. It really just is. And I just want you to remember, let me put this in your head. This is the same editorial board that basically probably all lives in the suburbs and writes as if they're right for a suburban audience. That's first what the Tribune does mostly. But second of all, the editorial board, they backed Richie Daley for election and re-election every time he ran. Every time. And then they backed Rahm Emanuel's election. Then they bombed Rahm Emanuel's re-election. They're not for progressive evidence-based reforms. Therefore, keep doing whatever you got to do to keep CEOs happy, Michigan Avenue pretty, the theater district pretty, and outside of that, they don't really care. Keep the money churning. And if you have to use Chicago taxpayer money to do it, they don't care. They will, that's fine. I'm talking about tax increment financing. All right, so we're going to go over a little context here. I'm going to read you a couple longer quotes from there, and it shows you the way of thinking in their piece. It just shows you, it reflects the thinking of the editorial board. See if you can pick it out when you hear it. Community groups blame Mayor Lightfoot for spending too much money on the police department and not enough on outreach. Lightfoot throws shade at Fox's office for being too passive on offenders who show up at bond court. Fox questions police protocols and points to decisions being made by Cook County judges. And Chief Judge Timothy Evans says his judges can only work off the information brought to them by law enforcement, however incomplete. Did you get it? Did you see what was really wrong? First of all, they're not talking about the police department whatsoever in there. They let off David Brown in the police department because, God, they haven't done anything wrong. They were not responsible for problems in the criminal justice system. Let's just skip them altogether. That shows you thinking right there. That's a problem. Next, pay attention. Community groups blame Mayor Lightfoot for spending too much money on the police department and not enough money on outreach. How do you define outreach? What does that mean? I think if we want to Chicago cred and ready Chicago, they'd be kind of pissed at the work they're being done qualified as outreach. But see, that's the way of thinking of the Tribune editorial board. That's how little they care about what the work that's being done on the streets in communities. They don't care. Okay? Notice also, they didn't look. There's no mention of the finances of the city. Nothing. None at all. Just completely skipped. As long as it's spending more money on more cops, they're fine. Here's a second one. We, as a city and a region, have been dealing with finger pointing and plausible deniability for years as violent crime numbers have swelled. As residents give up and move away, and yes, as more Chicagoans die in violent confrontations or become victims of crime. You can hardly mention Chicago anywhere in the world without a reaction about shootings and violence. My question for these people is, where the hell are they traveling? Now, I've traveled a bit, probably not as much as those rich people, but let me give you a list, just, so we get an idea what I'm talking about here. So grew up in Chicago, living in D.C. now, been to Vancouver 2 or 3 times, Quebec City, Mexico multiple times now over the last 10 years. My wife is Mexican. Peru, England, France, Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, South Africa, New Zealand. In all that traveling, and all the talking I've talked about, all the time I've talked about being from Chicago, I have heard absolutely zero things about street violence in Chicago. Zero inquiries and questions. Zero. What I have heard time and time again is police department violence. Why'd they shoot this person? Why did they kill that person? We saw that video. What is going on with the Chicago Police Department? What is wrong with your government? How do they let that? How racist are they? That's what I hear. I heard that from an ambassador. We were having dinner. We ended up sitting down with a couple. She was the ambassador to another Southern African country, not South Africa, from a European country. And I don't remember exactly where the matches are, so I'm not going to say which ones because I don't want to get it wrong. But they didn't talk to us about, oh my God, you're from Chicago. Oh my God, the violence. They talked about Chicago Police Department shooting people. And then they talked about Donald Trump. That's not what that is white suburbanite thinking about what people must be talking about, because that's what people are talking about at our country club. So they must be talking about it all over the world. It's bullshit. Bullshit. So you look in those quotes and you realize nothing Nothing has anything to do with the Chicago Police Department. Nothing. After everything we've been through, the Quan McDonald, now the Adam Toledo shooting, which I don't equate them. I think they're different, very different. We'll get into that later, and I've talked about it in other shows. But everything we've gotten, the Abadi case where they beat that woman or tried to beat the woman. He was too drunk to do it, but that was played all over the world. This is just suburban white male thinking. Why are people leaving Illinois because of the violence? And, some people are leaving Chicago because it's just getting too expensive to live in it. And by the way, you want to talk about another factor that plays into this? Look at some of your reporting editorial board. Look at the people you have endorsed for office, and look at all the crime and corruption and bad leadership that they've put on the city. So what I would say to the Trib editorial board, look inward, my friends. Look inward before you go looking outward. And you may want to look at the police department a little bit too. Okay, our second segment. Another editorial from the Tribune. They were hot this last week. The unbearable tragedy of Adam Toledo. This one actually is much better. And I agree with some of the stuff in there. Here's the problem. And this is what you're going to get from a right-wing conservative paper. They will only look at reforms that are going to adjust policing or the circumstances of the community. They only look at policing. If you want to change things for communities and in the city around policing and justice and how do you empower communities, it can only be done in the box that they set up, that they define, and it's only around policing changes. Policing changes will help to some degree. But no matter how much you change the police department, you ain't going to change the circumstances in those communities. Changing the police department is not going to prevent the shooting that Adam Toledo seems to have been involved in that brought the police to him that night. What's going to do it is changing the circumstances in the community. But that is not something the Tribune editorial board has any interest in because that would cost money. And that would mean Mayor Lightfoot would have to realign the way the city does things and take money from paying for, cranes. With our tax dollars, you look at those cranes throughout the city, and a lot of those are paid for by tax dollars, but the Tribune editorial board loves it. They love TIF money, tax increment finance money, like it did in the South Loop and in the West Loop, Fulton Market area, and others, driving gentrification because that makes white rich people money, and it puts the numbers down so the city looks better to the suburbanite audience of the Tribune. Basically, just about every policy that has harmed these communities on the South and West Sides, that creates the circumstances that drives the violence and crime in these communities, the Tribune is backed. They've definitely endorsed and backed all the corrupt, horrible mayors we have had. They endorse them all. They couldn't get enough of Rahm. They couldn't get enough of Mayor Daley. While the Loop got rich, and the South Loop was created, right? While that happened, he was stealing money from South and West Side's communities. Stealing it. They didn't care. They love it. It's just sick. You're going to see changes. You ain't going to see changes if that's what you're doing. It just isn't it. But they don't want it. They're never going to give up on that. That paper doesn't really give a crap about anyone in the city. Maybe a little bit on the north side where they buy the paper. They don't care about the south and west sides. They want those people controlled. And to have to use as little taxpayer money to do it. In 2019, the Chicago Tax Increment Financing Program took $1 billion, $989 million. So $1 billion out of the city's tax general revenue fund. $1 billion. And the mayor could spend it on anything they wanted. Trib boards loves that. Great. Keep buying cranes. Keep subsidizing buildings. That damn stadium over in the South Loop area we don't need, that DePaul plays in. keep subsidizing the hell out of it because our friends as stockholders and us as stockholders and all our friends, CEO, corporate friends, and all the people in the suburbs, they benefit from it, so keep doing it. They don't give a shit. Nothing is going to change until we change the economics. It would be great to say otherwise. It just isn't going to happen. Do we need to change reforms in the police department? Absolutely. Do we need to do better training? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Sure. But the real change is coming when you change the economics circumstances in those communities. All right. Segment 3. So Jamie Calvin from the Invisible Institute over near the University of Chicago area, he wrote a piece recently in The Intercept. I'll show you it here. And it's basically, it mostly focuses on ShotSpotter. Actually, I'm not sure exactly 100% what this thing focused on. It seemed very rushed to me. And it was definitely below what you would normally see from Jamie. That's for sure. Now, let me just say right from the beginning, ShotSpotter, the technology mostly sucks. I'm not arguing that. Jamie Calvin, he's right on that. It sucks. It's been a wide variety of cities have adopted it, some lesser number of them have dumped it. Many of them. So I'm not defending ShotSpotter. But once again, which is so common in police reform and politics, we're calling for a reform that would make no difference in the Adam Toledo shooting. No difference. Don't listen to the bullshit. No difference. Okay, so let me give you a quote. All right, first of all, ShotSpotter claims, according to Calvin, and I believe it, no reason to doubt it, a 97% accuracy rating on their website. As Calvin says, total bullshit. That's a lie. And 97, what does that mean? It's a technology. ShotSpotter is a technology like an acoustic system. They set up in certain areas of the city, in the south and west side. And it basically alerts cops through a message, almost instantaneous, to a shooting. The problem is, it has a relatively, although we don't actually have real hard numbers, it has a relatively high rate of false positives. Means it gets the numbers, but they have no idea. It gets the sound and it says, boom, it's a shooting, and cops rush to the scene, but a lot of times it's fireworks, a car backfiring, it could be all kinds of things. So ShotSpotter's numbers are bullshit. So let's get that right in the beginning. Okay, here's a quote from the article, Calvin's article. Now, Calvin is quoting what must be insider news, insider numbers he got somehow from the MacArthur Foundation, who is releasing a report this week. I don't think it said that in the article. I found out because I emailed Calvin and Jonathan Maines. It was how I think you pronounce him, Jonathan. I hope I'm getting your name right, from the MacArthur Center, and said, hey, I want a copy of that study where Calvin got his numbers, and Jonathan got back to me right away on Saturday and said, we are publishing this coming week, and I'll send you one when it's done. Awesome. So we can only take what's in the article from Calvin, but I want to put some context into it in case you read the Calvin article, and we're going to do a spot next week on the report, I'm sure. Taking conservative approach, the percentage of ShotSpotter alerts that resulted in no case report being filed was a little over 85%, according to the MacArthur Justice Center. Now, that number's without context and incredibly squishy. Okay? What do you mean? What do I mean without context? First, what's the number, if you want context, what's the number of the average shooting incident before ShotSpotter where someone calls the police? How often, when the police respond and say, hey, there were shots fired on my block or in the alley behind my house, and cops respond, at what rate do they get there and everyone's gone? Now, if you believe that most or lots of the violence, I shouldn't even say that. If a lot of the violence involves people of color, mostly men, many of them gang affiliated or clique affiliated or are affiliated with some kind of illicit business, or just flat out not trusting the police department, if they're the shooter or the person shot at, and you're not if you're either one, especially if you're the person shot at and you're not hit, are you going to stick around and wait to talk to the police? We know communities of color don't trust the police department. So if you were just shot at and many times involved in illicit markets, are you going to stay around and talk to police? The answer is no. No. So I don't doubt that 85% number is right. What I don't understand is that any better or worse than the average? There's a shots fired, call 911, someone calls 911. Is that better or worse? Because it could be that 90% of the time when people call 911 without a ShotSpotter alert, the police go and there's nothing and they don't write a report. And that with ShotSpotter, they're actually able to increase the amount they're able to write a report by 50%. That could even be statistically significant. We could argue whether it's relevant and whether it should be done, but it could be statistically significant. So without that number, I'm not sure what that means. 2, I want to get to this, and it's very important. The Adam Toledo shooting. The cops were alerted by ShotSpotter, but people called 911. So even without ShotSpotter, police were going to respond to the scene. So even if we got rid of ShotSpotter, it most likely would have made no difference. Cops were going to rush to that scene regardless. So I'm not sure if this is it, but it kind of, because it was written so close in time, and it talks a lot about the Adam Toledo shooting in the article, it kind of makes it seem like ShotSpotter was responsible for creating the circumstances solely, and they weren't. People called 911. I believe there were 2 or 3 calls. They were going there anyways. So I'm fine getting rid of ShotSpotter. I don't know how good it is, or at least having a real, open, transparent evaluation of what it does. But I'm not sure the numbers as quoted by Kelvin really make a case either way. So I hope this report from the MacArthur Justice System does, MacArthur Justice Center, not system. I hope they do it. We're going to try to have Jonathan Maines or someone from the center on after the report is released to talk about it. But I have my questions. I'm not a fan of ShotSpotter, but I'm just not sure. First of all, I know it wouldn't have made most likely no difference in the Adam Toledo circumstances. And it might be a reform that's needed, but I don't like connecting it to the Adam Toledo shooting, so I don't think it had much of a role. And certainly wouldn't have stopped the police from going there. Okay, on to the next segment. This is an op-ed written in the State Journal Registry. I believe I've got that right. And this is a paper down in Springfield. And it's written by Madeline Barr, policy manager at CASE, Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, and Amanda Pyron, who's the executive director at the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network. For those, you should be getting a link in the chat, hopefully. Madeline Barr was on our show a few months back, maybe 5-6 months back, talking about, and there is in the chat, thank you. They were in the chat. She was on the show 5-6 months ago to talk about this very thing about, they released a report about how bad the sexual assault response is by the Chicago Police Department. There's no doubt that is true, but she also talked about what's in this op-ed, which is the fact that the criminal justice system, the agencies, try to shield themselves from reform by exploiting survivors, as if the reforms will somehow automatically hurt survivors. And this happened most recently in HB 3653, which was the large omnibus bill set of reforms signed not too long ago by Governor Pritzker. Sorry about that. Governor Pritzker into law, and had all kinds of things, front end, middle, back end justice system reforms. And so here's one quote that's telling about what this op-ed is trying to communicate. Change for the better is coming due to Governor Pritzker's signature on the criminal justice reform legislation, HB 3653, that will end cash bail. Wait a minute. The justice system is telling us cash bail is not very good. That's going to be the end. Victims are doomed. Not true. So we're going to go into two more quotes. One is longer, and actually, I'm going to give you, it's a long quote here, but I think it's really important to read it so you get an idea what is going on. Policies rooted in fear-mongering and racism have never actually served survivors, yet too many people continue to push an agenda that perpetrates a criminal legal system that fails victims and disproportionately harms Black and brown communities. It's a great day when you're seeing advocates for survivors speak up like this. There's no doubt about it. I'll continue. Contrary to the false arguments advanced by opponents, the new pretrial system will not simply release every person arrested for a crime. For example, it will ensure people held for forcible felonies, including domestic violence and sexual assault, are kept for up to 48 hours. It will give the state time to gather information about whether someone poses a threat to others. It is a welcome reform to the current practice of releasing people who can pay the bond with minimal regard for the threat they may pose to survivors. Ladies and gentlemen, as they just so eloquently said and said better than I, the end of cash bail does not mean everyone's being released pre-trial. It doesn't mean that. It's much more nuanced. And it also doesn't mean just because someone can afford the bail, they get out even if they're a threat. Here's one last quote. Domestic violence survivors will be able to ask police to finally take away abusers' guns after their FOID card, firearm identification card for concealed carry, or just carry now in Illinois, I believe, is revoked, and law enforcement will actually follow through. What does that mean? Check this quote out. Something you don't see in the papers all too often. There was some blowback not too long ago about this a little bit, but 34,000 had the courts ordered their guns removed from them, and by state law, the police are supposed to do that, and most still have their guns. 34,000 abusers were supposed to have their guns removed. And because the police are lazy, incompetent, overworked, take your pick, most of those people still have their guns. That's how much that justice system, as it sits before this legislation was passed, cared about victims of violence, survivors of domestic violence. They had courts order it, the police just didn't do it. Mind-boggling. And yet these are the same agencies claiming these reforms, they're going to make survivors, they're going to be deaths, murders, they're going to be so much less safe than they are now. It's like, well, if you're not removing 34 guns from 34,000 people who have had court orders to remove their guns from them, how much less safe can those people be? Come on. It's a joke. It's a great op-ed. I suggest everyone reads it. And if in the link is the link to our YouTube interview, the Chicago Justice Show interview with Madeline Barr several months ago about a report they did about the CPD's response to sexual assault. It's really interesting. Look at the op-ed. Watch our interview with Madeline Barr. It's very interesting. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 1-minute break, and we'll be right back to talk about some national stuff. Join a group of engaged and committed individuals advocating for transparency and accountability in the local justice system around the country. Get engaged through crowdsourced research projects, digital activism, public policy advocacy, or become a social media ambassador. Our criminal justice system will not reform itself. Communities must demand it. Transparency can be the fuel for justice our local communities need to combat the weaponizing of data by our justice system. Transformation of our justice system cannot occur until we know exactly what they are doing and who they are doing it to. Get involved today. CJP Nation. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. We are back. Okay, we're going to talk, and we're going to be adding in more and more national things to the show when it's called for. So our first segment out of the break here is about a poll done by the Washington Post and ABC News. And basically what you're seeing here is, read you the title, most Americans support greater scrutiny of police as discrimination concerns persist. Post ABC poll finds. It's really pretty interesting. So let's take some look at the numbers. And listen, take all poll numbers with some degree with a grain of salt, but the numbers, the responses have stayed pretty consistent over time, as we'll talk about here. So put some faith in that. So 6 in 10 Americans believe the country should do more to hold police accountable for mistreatment of black citizens. Well, blacks, period. That's a high number. That's a really high number. You could argue, given the events of, God, the last week, if not the last month, if not the last year, you think that number might be higher. But you got to understand, 40-some% voted for Trump. So that means if you're getting 6 out of 10, you're getting some Trumpers in there. Probably a few stragglers in there. So I think that number is pretty amazing given the circumstances of the country right now and how jaded everyone is. Let's look at a few more numbers here. In 2014, 54% said they were confident police were trained adequately to avoid using excessive force. That was in 2014. 6 years later, in July of 2020, that was at 47% in the midst of the protests and unrest related to the murder of George Floyd. That dropped by 7 percentage points. Then, in April 2021, just within the last couple of weeks, that number has dropped to 44%. That is amazing. Those numbers are amazing. And hopefully that number can be carried over to make some real differences. And it doesn't mean just changing policy. It means reallocating funds that go to police for alternative responses. Let's get the police department out of responding to things they should not be responding to. All right, hold on. Got a few more numbers here for you. 33% say the country is doing too much to interfere in how police are doing their jobs. That's right, 33%, which is less than, by the way, the number of Trump gets in his, I think Trump's around 42%. So it's still some Trumpers think that the police aren't doing everything right, but at least a third of the country says we're doing too much to interfere with the police. Let them loose, let them kill people. Don't worry about it. How do you look at the killing? I think it's Dante, right? I'm sorry, I can't keep all the people they kill, all their names right in all the cities, right? In the suburbs of Minneapolis. How do you look at that? They stopped him, and we'll talk about it in a couple segments from now, but it was about an air freshener, and a 27-year veteran, head of the police department, and I think involved in training, somehow mistakes her gun for a taser, and then you can still say cops are trained adequately. It's a third of the country. It's mind-boggling. 40% voted for Trump, so why should we be surprised by that number? Okay, let's turn real quick to Biden. 42% doing too little to... Biden is doing too little on police reform. 32% doing right amount, so about a third of the country. 15% doing too much. I'm not sure what Biden doing too much was, because I'm not sure what the hell he was doing before Neil Gorsuch, just within the last several days, announced 2 civil rights investigations, one into the Minneapolis Police Department, and I think today it broke. We'll be covering it in the coming days. Another civil rights investigation into the Louisville Police Department. If this is what's coming out of the Gorsuch Justice Department, 2 right away, back to back, that's encouraging. And I've been on the record, and I'll stay on the record. I'm for the civil rights investigations. I'm for consent decrees. But if we put all our apples in there, we're still going to be in the same place we are now, just slightly better 10 or 20 years from now. So I hope Biden starts listening to that 42% and starts doing more and not less. Not exactly sure what he could do other than either funding through the federal government or pushing for funding for alternative response systems. Sending more military gear to the police department is not going to do it. Okay, our next segment is basically spurred on by an article out of the Atlantic called "American Police Are Inadequately Trained." They ain't lying. Are police trained adequately? No, they are not. Does it need to be improved? Yes, it does. I've been on the record. I am for the city building the Chicago Police Department a new academy, but I think it should be tied to massive reforms in their police accountability system and in their contract. That contract needs to be gutted in the police accountability system, and without it, you can't give them that new academy. It must be a bargaining chip. I don't think Lightfoot's doing it. Okay, will it solve? Let's get back. Will training solve all the problems in policing? No. It'll make it better, but it won't. It ain't going to solve it. The solution's got to be outside the police department. Got to be outside the police department and nothing less. I wish it could solve it. I want it to be able to solve it. It can't. They definitely need massive amounts of training to make it better. But I think our priority should be removing them from many, many calls they don't need to go on, and removing them from traffic stop violations, by the way, and stop pulling people over for air fresheners, which are fishing expeditions. But we'll talk about that in 2 segments from now. Okay. According to the article, training academies in the U.S. are about 5 months in the academy and about 3 months on the street. I will tell you, in Chicago, it is 6 months in the academy, and they're on probation for 18 months, but I don't think that 18 months counts as training. They're just a probationary officer. I don't think that counts as training at all, so let's say 6 months. In many European countries, it can be 3 to 4 months. I've talked about this on our show early on with Barry Friedman from the Policing Project at NYU Law School. And we both agreed that if they're not going to bring in progressive training and change the training, like 3 or 4 years of the same crapola training they're getting now instead of 6 months is not going to make any difference. Make things worse. But 3 or 4 trainings with 3 or 4 years of training and real progressive reforms would be, it would make some pretty big changes. Still wouldn't be all of it, but it would make some big ones. The article also goes into how Biden's administration can bring up national standards for policing. I think that's a good idea. I think a lot of rural and smaller departments and smaller suburban departments could take a lesson from what goes on in Alaska, which is there are city departments, but anywhere outside of the cities, they're state police, and they go through the state police academy, and they're trained through the state police, and they have oversight through the state police system. I think smaller suburbs, if not all suburbs, and rural departments could definitely benefit from that. Little to no ongoing firearms training besides qualifying once a year once you leave the academy. Absolutely horrific. And that may have led to this thing in Minneapolis with Dante Wright, where this police officer mistook her gun for her taser. I'm not sure there's evidence she just wanted to kill Dante Wright, but how you are on the job 27 years and you can't tell one from the other, horrific. Obviously, that is if there was no intent to kill and that was actually an accident, that just means the training is awful. And remember, she was the head of the police union there. And there's no, especially in Chicago, there's really no use of force refreshers once they leave the department. Obscene. I have a source of mine on the job, and he had time to work with federal agents and federal task force, and he would say to me, like, the FBI, they get once a year, they go back to the academy and they get use of force training, and they get hands-on, how to use your hands and how to wrestle someone to the ground. They get that refresher. Nothing in the CPD. Nothing. It is part of the consent decree. We'll hope that changes things. But we really need something that changes the system entirely throughout the country. So I think a national standards would be a great idea. Okay, our next segment. This should have me feeling better than it does. But you got to understand where it's coming from. So this is a post on the Arnold Ventures, used to be the Arnold Foundation website, who, by the way, just for a little context, has turned us down for funding multiple times. We need, I'll read the title, we need criminal justice data that doesn't exist. Here's how the Biden administration can fix it. Listen, do we need better data? You're damn right. No doubt about it. But the way this is written by the Arnold Foundation, these are technical assistance people. These are people that think the police departments around the country are going to, if they collect better data, they'll use it. They won't. No. I should say that they won't entirely, but for the most part, they won't. Large urban departments, no. And they're going to keep it secret because it's going to show them having problems. Rural departments, smaller suburban departments, they don't have the resources. Now, the feds could give it to them, but it's still too focused on the technical assistance, internal, not transparent enough data system. They want it for internal processes. That can't be. If we're going to do this and we're going to spend federal money to do this, this data needs to be open to the public. I'm all for them sharing it across agency better, but all that data has got to be shared with the public. Period. End of statement. Okay, we're going to go into some of the recommendations real quick. The Biden administration should establish a National Commission on Criminal Justice Data Modernization. I'm for this, but only if it is there's people on there and the goal hardwired into this commission is making all of it as much as humanly possible public. And national standards about what data should be kept for privacy and everything else opened. Period. Just having the police department collect more data so they can not do anything with it, or the prosecutors or the courts, no. Fail. Here's the next one. The Biden administration should create a major push for data transparency. Hallelujah. However, they basically talk about a dashboard that rates police departments on how transparent they are to kind of push them to be more transparent. I don't think the police departments, especially the big ones, are going to give a shit about that. I think this is advocacy being done, a little bit by people who don't know what the hell they're doing related to advocacy. These departments aren't going to, unless they're forced, make data available. So that's just the bottom line. Let's go on to the next one. For example, the federal government could provide incentive funding to states that improve data quality and adopt better standards for reporting and collecting data. It could also fund research and technical assistance on data quality metrics and how to implement them. That sounds good. I like incentive funding, but any incentive funding that isn't tied to almost absolute transparency is worthless. The departments are never going to open up data that makes them look bad. If it's up to them, they have to be forced. Two more real quick. The Biden administration should create connections between data systems to foster data sharing and cross-system coordination. All for it, but could you imagine the Chicago Police Department, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office sharing each other's data with them and then them not going to the press and leaking and undercutting people? No. You're asking for them all to just get along, and that ain't going to happen, especially in large jurisdictions. 1, 2, I'm not sure if we do. I'm not sure it's in the benefit that they get along. We want the police department. We want the prosecutors to be a check on the police department. We want the police department to be a check on the prosecutors. We don't want them getting along. And then building systems to just share data internally with no transparency built in. The federal government should make strides in improving criminal justice system technology. This I agree with, but again, only built in if it's all going to be transparent. Other than that, forget about it. I know I'm a broken record on all of this. I don't want to make them just do their jobs better, although that's a bump somewhere. Building fancier databases for them to use just so they can keep their data closed and keep screwing people, not up for it. But this is how a technical assistance organization, this is how a foundation that just wants to make small tweaks in the system, this is how they think, and this is what you get for it. Sad, they've got the money to do it. They should be doing it right. All right. Or funding people that are. Little pitch. Here's our last segment of the night, ladies and gentlemen. How a common air freshener can result in a high-stakes traffic stop. And this is talking about Dante Wright. Police departments around the country, by incompetent, useless, moronic, racist state legislatures, county boards, city councils, mayors, governors have been empowered and has crept in from the 70s and just kept creeping in with the drug war putting it on overdrive. The police departments have been empowered to just keep on getting involved in our lives over the simplest, stupidest things. The one that the article's talking about in the headline, air fresheners. You can get pulled over, and I'm not sure if you can still be pulled over in Illinois for this, or if they've changed this, but you can get pulled over for not having a seatbelt on. You can get pulled over for having an air freshener hanging from your mirror, or something hanging from your rearview mirror. How stupid is that? Now listen, I would love everyone not to have anything hanging from their mirrors. I think that's stupid. Air freshener, prom thing, I don't give a shit what it is. It's just stupid. Shouldn't do it. But the more we empower, the more we have empowered police officers to get involved in our lives and have pretexts for stops, the more dangerous those stops have gotten. The more you increase those stops, the more deaths you're going to have from those stops. Plain and simple. Very simple. Right? And this is not done by police departments, although they probably pushed it behind the scenes. This is being put in the law by legislatures, city councils, county boards. They're the ones to blame. The police department should have had no authority to pull over Dante Wright for an air freshener. Because that's the problem. Every time you let a person with a gun get involved, engage with a citizen, there's always potential for it to go bad. It is. It's just the bottom line. Some percentage of them will go bad per year, automatically. The only difference between now and 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago is the fact that now we have cameras and body cameras, and now we have cameras on our cell phones. So these things are being recorded. This isn't new abuse. This is just abuse now being caught on tape. What the ACLU talks about, the ACLU is quoted in here, do the benefits of these stops, or does the danger of the stop outweigh the benefit? I would ask, what are the benefits? What's the real benefit? Is there a major benefit to society to have these stops? I don't know. I really don't think you could make a persuasive argument for a lot of these engagements. We saw that engagement on the red line. It wasn't a stop like that, but it was a stop. They were stopping some guy, and they were shooting on the Grand Avenue stop in Chicago. They ended up shooting a guy because an engagement went bad because he was walking between cars. Is that any less stupid than an air freshener? No. That guy was white, too. I don't think a persuasive argument can be made that many of these stops are in the public interest. Now, what happens, this is where the police are going to argue, when we're able to engage in people, and sometimes we find drugs, sometimes we find guns, sometimes in the Dante Wright case, we find warrants for things. I'm not sure you're doing that enough to outweigh the badness, both in the relationship between the minority communities and underserved communities and the police, but also in the violence that stems. Not all by any means the fault of the police, but we have to look at that and ask serious questions. Are the police the best people to be doing traffic stops? Do most traffic stops that aren't about real reckless driving or DUIs where someone is obviously swerving really in the interest of the public? Now, here I'm going to flip it and say that there are some people benefiting from these things, ladies and gentlemen. And this is what this article pops out, highlights dramatically. It benefits officers. Remember, we talked about the red line stop some episodes ago again. That was all about generating activity and paper and showing those cops that were sitting on the train all day had actually done something, engaged people, wrote tickets, brought money into the city. Well, when you give cops the ability to pull over anyone, especially minorities, for air fresheners and seatbelts, what they're actually doing is these are fishing expeditions. That's what these really are. These are fishing expeditions. And then in the New York Times article, you can see quotes about officers just walking up to a black guy. Do you have marijuana? Do you smoke marijuana? Do you have marijuana in the car? Do you have drugs in the car? Do you have a weapon in the car? Those are the first words out of the cop's mouth. It has nothing to do with the air freshener. They're looking for bigger things. That's a fishing expedition. Those things have to stop. I think, as I've read it before earlier this show and on previous shows, these are things we can get the cops out of completely. And I think you're going to see a massive change in relationship between the public and the police, especially minority communities, because they're just going to have so much a reduction in engagements with the police, period. And they're certainly going to be stopped from having just these fishing expeditions. And when not experiencing those, you might see the relationship change. And that would be all for the good. All for the good. It's a really fascinating article. The links to everything we've talked about are in the chat. And for those catching this on the podcast, if you go to our page in the news section where the podcast is posted, you can get the links and you can get all the images shown on and videos shown throughout the show. They're all going to be embedded there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We will be back on Wednesday at 5:30 Central talking about Luis Gutierrez, ex-Congressman Luis Gutierrez ripping, God knows what he's ripping now. Was hoping he'd go away, but no, he's back. And we'll be talking about other things related to the Adam Toledo shooting and other justice-related issues. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week. I'll see you Wednesday next week. I'll see you Wednesday. Thank you.